So we have Brianna Guild here, and she's going to be going over the Literacy Essentials Toolkit for SLPs. So we all learned about literacy in grad school, but if you haven't done it in a while, then you might have forgotten some of those foundational concepts. Go ahead and put in the chat if it's been a while since you've worked on literacy. And while you're doing that, we are going to go ahead and talk about the agenda. So first, we're going to do some introductions and backgrounds. And then Brianna's going to give us a brief overview of the science of reading. Then she'll talk about the roles and responsibilities of SLPs with respect to literacy. Then she'll talk about how SLPs can provide direct literacy instruction. And we'll wrap up with some references and closing remarks at the end. Brianna, thank you so much for coming back on today and just diving into more of a specific topic, but really an overview of literacy.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Can you go ahead and give a little background information about yourself?
Yep, so I'm a private practice SLP in Ontario, Canada. I currently provide mainly virtual speech therapy sessions, primarily in the areas of literacy, language, and articulation. And I created SLP Literacy Corner so that I could share resources mainly around literacy.
Amazing. And my name is Vanita Litvak. I go by she, her. I have a passion for AAC and all things literacy to support individuals with complex communication needs. I've had the opportunity to present at local and national conferences such as ASHA and co-authored the Lou Knows What to Do book series that was published by Boys Town Press. And when I am not doing speechy things or interviews, I love taking tennis lessons, trying new restaurants, and reading books with my 3.5-year-old. Brianna, can you share your financial disclosures?
Yep, so as the creator of SLP Literacy Corner, I do receive payment for anybody who purchases those products. I'm an affiliate for Got It Learning. They're a company who does reading and spelling games. And I'm also getting an honorarium for this presentation today.
Great. And then I have ownership interest in Speechy Side Up LLC and Tassel Learning LLC. I'm also an affiliate for Simple Practice and Meaningful Speech and receive commission with my code. And then I'm also a member of ASHA. All right, so by the end of this pod course, we hope that you'll be able to briefly explain the science of reading and structured literacy, identify at least 3 components of literacy instruction, list at least 3 roles of SLPs when it comes to literacy, and explain and use a variety of activities to target literacy skills. So let's start off with the basics. Can you give us a brief overview about the science of reading?
The science of reading refers to the collection of research from multiple disciplines, including psychology, neuroscience, and education, that provides scientific evidence for how we learn to read and write, and how to best support literacy development for all readers. The key word there being all. This research has provided insights into how we all learn to read, not just people with dyslexia or other learning disorders. And this evidence supports the importance of using a structured literacy approach, which teaches literacy skills through systematic and explicit instruction and incorporates systematic review of taught skills. So let's go through each of those components. Explicit means we're explicitly introducing and explaining phonics rules. There's no assuming that kids will figure it out. Systematic means we're following a logical scope and sequence for teaching those rules, typically from easier and more common spelling, like short vowel sounds, CVC words, to more challenging or less common spellings. There's a saying that a structured literacy approach is crucial for some, such as those with dyslexia, helpful for all, and harmful for none. When we use a structured literacy approach, every child benefits.
That's great to know.
So the science of reading is often contrasted with the balanced literacy approach, which involves using leveled books and the 3 cueing system to teach reading. The 3 cueing system teaches beginning readers to look at the picture, look at the first letter in the word, and think about what word makes sense in the sentence. But the 3-cueing system has not been backed by evidence, and it's essentially more guessing than reading. For many decades now, the research on reading has shown that we need to explicitly teach kids letter-sound correspondences and how to sound out words. This is because the human brain was not designed to read. Our brains have specific areas responsible for oral language and speech, but there are no specific areas designated for reading. Basically, we're not naturally wired to learn how to read like we are to develop oral language. And this makes sense when you think about the fact that humans have been using oral communication for the vast majority of our existence and only began using written communication about 5,000 years ago. We actually haven't been reading and writing that long in the grand scheme of human history. So our brains have a lot of work to do when it comes to learning how to read. Several areas in the brain must learn to work together to accomplish the task of reading. We have to learn that when we hear a word, for example, bug, that word is represented by the letters B, U, G, and that word could mean different things, like an insect or to annoy someone. Essentially, to learn to read, we have to tie together our knowledge of sounds, spelling, and semantics.
I'm glad that you explained that because as we were talking, I was thinking, oh, well, like cavemen could look at symbols and aren't like letters just a symbol. But you're right, reading is so much more than looking at the symbols and sounding out the symbols. It's also using inferencing and background knowledge, which you're going to talk all about that. So yes, maybe our brains were wired to like interpret symbols, but putting that together in meaning is a totally different skill.
Yeah, it's often thought of as this literacy processing triangle where you have sounds, spelling, and semantics. And we have to connect all of those very quickly while we're reading to make sense of what we're reading.
That makes sense. Yeah, it's very complex.
It is. So let's talk about some more of these reading models, such as the simple view of reading and Scarborough's reading rope. These models further explain that we need word recognition and language comprehension skills in order to become skilled readers and achieve that reading comprehension. Word recognition skills includes phonological awareness, decoding, and sight recognition. Language comprehension skills include vocabulary, background knowledge, language structure, verbal reasoning, and literacy knowledge. Then in 2021, the active view of reading further expanded these models by specifying that reading also involves active self-regulation skills, such as executive function skills, and bridging processes, such as morphological awareness and reading fluency. Like you said, learning how to read is a complicated process, so it makes sense when we think about this, everything that goes into reading, why it can be such a struggle for children who aren't given a systematic and explicit instruction in literacy.
That makes sense. I imagine that there's also more like executive function skills involved as well, and motivation and interest. Is that also included in that new active view of reading?
Yes, and honestly, the executive function skills that are involved are so plentiful that could be an entire course on itself.
Oh, that's good to know. Maybe we'll consider that as well. But thank you so much for sharing that. I wonder, everybody that's here, has anyone heard the difference between like structured literacy or balanced literacy, or are you using one or the other, or is your school district using one or the other? I'd be curious to know. So you could go ahead and put that in the chat. All right, so we cover everything here. Are we ready to move on to the next one, or do you have more that you want to add?
We are good to move on.
All right, let's do it. So we're still in the science of reading. Let's talk about whether SLPs should use a speech to print or print to speech approach.
Both approaches have been shown to be effective.
Yay.
So speech to print or structured linguistic literacy focuses on sounds first and teaches students that sounds in words are represented by letters. Ebley and SoundsRight are examples of speech to print programs. Print to speech focuses on letters first and teaches students to associate sounds with the written symbols or letters. Orton-Gillingham would be an example of a popular print to speech approach.
So what is the gold standard for literacy programs?
While there have been studies done that prove the effectiveness of specific approaches like Orton-Gillingham, there are not yet any published studies that compare the effectiveness of different approaches or programs to determine which one is best.
Okay, so still up in the air.
Yeah, we need more research that actually compares the two programs to each other and what the outcomes are.
So tell us, what's the best phonics, scope, and sequence to use?
Phonics sequences typically progress from easier and more common spellings like short vowel sounds and CVC words to longer and more complex words. In structured linguistic literacy, the sequence moves from the basic or initial code, where one letter represents one sound, to the advanced or extended code. However, there is not one best scope and sequence to follow for teaching phonics patterns.
What would be an
So,
example of like a more advanced code?
for example, that like IGH representing I.
Got it. Makes sense.
Yeah, so as you can see, there's a lot of research being done, but we have some of these common questions that we don't have enough concrete evidence to provide an answer.
Yeah, there's still more science to be done. I love Spencer Russell from Toddlers Can Read. He's done he did like a South by Southwest presentation recently, and another just like free webinar where he's talking to educators and parents about, let's stop arguing about what's the best approach for kids and let's just start teaching them to read with what we know is the best evidence right now, right? And I
Mhm.
just think that's a great way to look at it, because I think we do have all of these camps sometimes in literacy, like Orton Gillingham only, or this only. And so I really appreciate his perspective on that.
Yeah, I would agree.
So let's talk about the roles of the SLP when it comes to literacy, and just being mindful that there's not just SLPs here. The
Mhm.
primary like focus is SLPs, but we're also going to have caregivers and educators. So if any of this applies to educators as well, let's make sure we're speaking to them too.
Sounds good. So literacy does fall within that very broad SLP scope of practice, and SLPs can have a very important role in literacy. Like you said, there are other people that are involved, and those people are so important in teaching literacy to children. When it comes to SLPs are the language experts, and literacy is written language. So it probably won't surprise you to hear that spoken and written language have a reciprocal relationship. Individuals who have difficulty in one generally have difficulty in the other, and skill development in either domain results in growth in the other. So whether we're working on written or oral language, we are supporting both. And literacy is highly relevant to the populations that SLPs work with, because when children have difficulties acquiring speech or language, they are at a higher risk for literacy difficulties. Additionally, our knowledge of language and its subsystems, including phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics, and pragmatics, is highly important for the identification, assessment, and intervention of literacy delays and disorders. So when it comes to SLPs, overall, there's 4 main roles related to literacy: directly supporting literacy development, indirectly improving literacy using written language tasks to target speech or language goals or other goals, advocacy and education about best practice, and research to establish evidence-based practice. That research that we were talking about before.
Yeah, no, that's great. And since we do have a lot of SLPs here, I want to see who is familiar with the research on the correlation between articulation disorders and literacy difficulties. There's like a
Mhm.
percentage, right? So if you know that percentage, go ahead and drop it in the chat. You'll be entered to win one of our giveaways, and we'll answer that on the next slide. Does that sound good, Brianna?
Yeah, so directly supporting literacy development includes preventing literacy difficulties by fostering language acquisition and emergent literacy, identifying children at risk for literacy difficulties, such as those with speech sound disorders and developmental language disorders, assessing reading and writing skills, providing literacy intervention informed by assessment results, and documenting progress and outcomes through intervention. So SLPs also use literacy tasks when we have students read words during a game to work on speech sound production, or use book reading and storytelling to work on language goals. So we can strategically incorporate more literacy skills, such as print awareness, phonological awareness, and phonics into sessions, especially with students who have speech sound disorders and developmental language disorders. So we can incorporate more literacy, but we're still targeting and collecting data for our primary goal, which would be the speech sound production or oral language development.
Awesome. Are you going to talk a little bit more about advocacy and education and research, or do we want to go to the next slide?
I can talk more about that.
Okay, perfect.
So SLPs play an essential role in literacy advocacy, education, and research by advocating for students' literacy needs, consulting with parents, teachers, and other professionals, advocating for effective practices across settings, educating others to help more people better understand literacy development and the importance of a structured literacy approach, and advancing the knowledge base about literacy by conducting and publishing more research.
That's great. Thank you for sharing or expanding on all of those. So, can you explain the components of direct literacy intervention and really not explain, maybe explaining for some of our educators and some of our caregivers? This should probably be a review for speech language pathologist.
So the research outlines multiple components of effective literacy instruction. In 2000, the National Reading Panel did a review of reading research that identified the key components as phonological awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. More recently, in 2020, the International Dyslexia Association identified the key components of structured literacy as phoneme awareness, sound symbol or phoneme grapheme correspondences, orthography, morphology, syntax, and semantics. So I hope you can see there is a lot of overlap in those lists. And personally, I think one takeaway from the research is that literacy is more than just phonics or just reading comprehension. It's more than one thing. There are many components that we need to consider and explicitly work on with children to help them become proficient readers.
Yeah, that makes sense. I was trying to map the other studies like components with these, but I could definitely see some overlap there.
Mhm.
Okay, great. And we're going to expand on all of these a little bit more. We're going to give an explanation of each, and then you're going to talk about some activities that therapists and educators and caregivers can use. So I'm excited about that. You ready to go to the next one?
Let's go.
All right. So let's start with phonological awareness. What is it? And yeah, basically give us an overview of it.
Phonological awareness is the ability to recognize and manipulate the sounds in spoken language, including words and sentences, syllables in words, and phonemes in words. Research has identified the particular importance of phonemic awareness skills in reading and writing, specifically phoneme blending and segmenting. To read or decode a word, an individual must determine each individual phoneme and then blend those phonemes together into the word. And then we have the opposite. To spell a word, an individual must break down the word into phonemes and then determine how to spell each phoneme.
They have to be able to manipulate those phonemes.
Correct.
Got it.
So let's talk about some activity ideas, how to do that.
Perfect.
A great skill to start with is phoneme isolation. This involves teaching students to identify individual phonemes in words. For example, the initial phoneme in chop is ch. You can give students words orally or use pictures or those mini objects and have students identify the initial, medial, or final sounds in words to help them learn how to isolate a phoneme. Current favorite is word generating games. This is a fun way to have students generate words that start with a particular sound. I like to do these at the start of a session as a warm-up. For example, if we're working on that CH digraph, I might generate the word chop and have my student repeat the word. And then I have my student generate a different word that starts with ch, and they might say chat. I usually do 3 turns each for a total of 6 words. And then we try to remember all 6 words in order. So we would go chop, chat, go back and forth, trying to remember all 6. So this activity is working on phonological awareness, specifically that initial phoneme, generating words that start with a particular sound, vocabulary, and it has a memory component. So you'll see a lot of the activities that we're going to talk about today actually work on multiple skills at once.
That's great.
Mm-hmm.
I love the game. I'm going to try that one.
I do it with articulation clients as well. The same game, but it's our target speech sound.
I'd actually like to see, while you're listing the rest of the activities, if anybody has some other activity recommendations that they use for phonological awareness, please drop those in the chat so everybody can see them and kind of maybe take them, because they might be good ideas.
Absolutely. I would really love for this to be a great way to just share more activity ideas.
Perfect.
The last one I'll talk about for phonological awareness is called Say It, Move It, Spell It. And this is a great activity to work on phoneme awareness and phonics by incorporating letters into the task. So on paper, there's a circle and then 2 lines underneath. You say a word like chat. The student repeats the word, says it, and then moves a counter into the circle for each sound in the word. So it would go ch, ah, t. They say the sound as they move the counter into the circle.
Oh, okay.
Next, they move the counter onto the top line, saying each sound as they move the counter. So they're in the circle, and then they would move them onto the first line, ch, ah, t. And last, they map each sound to the spelling by writing the letters on the bottom line. You can also use letter manipulatives. So that's the spell it. So how do we spell ch, ch? How do we spell a? How do we spell t? What's the word? Chat. So then you're blending it back together.
Okay, I'm drawing a little diagram of this on my notes. That's a fun idea. I like that.
And then for all of our activity ideas, I thought we could do an example of how to incorporate a personal interest. One interest that I have that I share with a lot of my students is Pokemon. So I'm often finding ways to include Pokemon and other interests into our literacy tasks. So Pokemon will be the ongoing example, but I hope you can draw some parallels to other interests that your students might have.
Perfect.
The great thing is you can work on things like phonics and phonological awareness with any words, right? So naturally, you can work on them with Pokemon names.
Yeah, we do princess in my home.
Princess is a good one. To work on those phoneme isolation skills, you can identify the initial or final phoneme in Pokemon names. For example, the initial phoneme in Bulbasaur is B. You can work on segmenting skills by segmenting Pokemon names into phonemes or syllables. For example, Charmander is segmented into the syllables char, man, der. And I also like to work on oral blending skills by playing Secret Pokemon, where I give a student phonemes or syllables, and they have to blend those together to determine the secret Pokemon. So, for example, I might give them the syllables Pi-ka-chu. What was my secret Pokemon? Pikachu.
If they're so interested in this topic, not to like downplay the activity, but if they're so interested in the topic, wouldn't it be very easy for them to discern what those syllables are together versus if you were doing like a nonsense word or something that wasn't as interesting?
Fair, the Pokemon names can get pretty long, and there are a lot, so you could pull ones they don't know. You could always like see what they're interested in and maybe pull, if you're concerned they're just going to know all of the content or the words, pull maybe the less familiar words from that area to use if that's a concern, but I haven't encountered that issue yet personally.
Okay. I'm just thinking about my daughter and I was like, roar. I know she's going to know that like right away, but maybe I could counter it with a nonsense or maybe another character that's within that movie or something like you're suggesting with Pokemon.
Yeah, pulling in more characters would be a great idea.
Okay, I'll try that. Thank you. I love that. That's really great. Okay, ready to move on to the next one?
Let's go to phonics.
So let's talk about phonics and then we'll get into the activities.
Phonics is the relationship between the sounds of spoken language and the letters of written language. For example, the letter N represents the sound N, and it's the first letter in the word net. Phonics instruction also includes learning about morphology, the structure and form of words, multisyllabic words, the schwa vowel sound, and often the 6 written syllable types in English, which are closed, open, magic E or silent E, R-controlled, vowel team, and stable final. One difference in those approaches, speech to print versus print to speech. A print to speech approach will typically teach those 6 syllable types. A speech to print approach doesn't teach them as like grouped up like this. They would teach, for example, long A and all the ways that we could represent the long A sound in writing. And then, of course, we have phonetically irregular words too, which are sometimes called heart words. I think those are the words people commonly associate with those memorized sight word lists. Essentially, those are our irregular words.
Like there, like THEIR? Or no?
That would be an example. Yeah. Said would be an example.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. But they still, so is like that sight word approach and memorization better with those type of words, or they still need to learn the phonics?
I don't teach memorization anymore. Personally, I try to have students map out as much of the word as they can. So for example, in the word said, only that middle sound, is irregular, what we have to memorize, so to speak, or know by heart. So I would teach like, how do we spell S? How do we spell in this word? Oh, we have to remember that's an AI in this word said. And then that D you can map typically as well. So I really just focus on what's the one irregular piece in that word and try to get them to just map like how they would map any other word that is regular and just do the one memorization piece, not memorizing the whole word.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it's also like taking in some of the background knowledge. Like, oh, I've seen this word before, but I know how to at least sound out the s and the duh in it. And then I remember like with those sounds together and the A and the I, that it sounds like this. Okay. Thank you for that.
Of course. When we are thinking about phonics, really we're having students work on these phonics skills anytime that we have students read or write words, sentences, or paragraphs. So Even in your regular speech therapy sessions, if you are reading or writing word sentences or paragraphs, that is essentially a literacy task. It has a literacy component to it. So let's talk about some activities.
Great. And then same with this one, please, as Brianna is explaining her activities, go ahead and drop in the chat some activities that you might be using for phonics too.
One helpful resource that I have found is the book A Fresh Look at Phonics by Wiley Blevins. And I'm going to talk about two activities that are outlined in that book: word building and word sorting. In word building, students are given a set of letters and asked to create words. For example, they might be given a set of 5 to 10 letter tiles, depending on their age and skill set, and asked to find the letters to spell the word block. Then they're told to change the letter B to C and read the new word, which would be clock. For a greater challenge, students are told to make the word, like block, and then change it to clock. And this would be harder because they have to determine what letter to remove, what letter to add, and in which position. So even within word building, you can differentiate that based on your students' proficiency with that skill. In word sorts, students are given a set of words that have something in common and are asked to sort the words by their common feature. You might have a closed sort where you tell them how to sort the words. Maybe you're working on long A vowel teams and sorting words into the two groups AI or AY. You could also do an open sort. Again, this would be that more challenging level where a student has to figure out how to sort the words you give them into different groups. And then after a sort is complete, you want to talk about what they notice, or that spelling rule. So in this case, we would notice that AI is used in the middle of a syllable, whereas AY is used at the end of a syllable.
I'm smiling as you're saying that because I don't know that I've thought that much about that syllable. So it's funny as a speech language pathologist with our scope being so broad, and same thing with educators, like your scope is so broad that when you're teaching grammar or when you're teaching literacy, like I can see why people specialize in these areas because you really have to dive in.
You really do. Yeah. I always feel like there's so much more to learn. We'll talk about it later, but I'm working on the morphology and really doing more morphology with my students.
So you've got even more, you've narrowed even more into literacy.
I mean, I love all of it, but there's always just more to learn.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Let's talk about some Pokemon phonics activities. Okay. So I like to incorporate Pokemon names into our reading and spelling practice. If you go on the Pokemon website, there is a Pokédex, and there's a name and number search bar at the top that you can use to search for Pokemon. So you could type in a spelling pattern that you're working on, like AI for that vowel team, or an R-controlled vowel, AR, ER, and then select the magnifying glass to search. Just search for one of those patterns at a time, and then hit search, and you'll see all the Pokemon names that contain that specified spelling. So you can use this feature to have students read Pokemon names right on the website, which is fun because then they can also see the images of the Pokemon. Or if you think that might be too distracting, you could create a word list of the Pokemon names with the phonics patterns a student is learning or reviewing, and use that for reading or spelling activities. For example, an R-controlled word list might have Charmander, Charmeleon, Charizard, Squirtle, Wartortle, with those R-controlled vowels in it. Again, this is an activity that I do with articulation clients as well, and I'll just search the target that I'm working on. You just have to be careful with artic. If you're working on that k sound and you search a C, you're going to get Pokemon that have that soft C, or C making more of an S sound. So you have to be a bit mindful and maybe just check out the words that are coming up ahead of time, but it does work pretty low to no prep, which is nice. And most Pokemon names are multisyllabic, so it's great practice for reading multisyllable words. You can use Pokemon names to practice syllable division strategies, like dividing words into syllables based on the rule that every syllable has at least one vowel. You can also work on flexing the vowel sound to adjust the pronunciation of a vowel that occurs in an unaccented syllable, the schwa vowel sound. For example, in Pikachu, we don't say Pikachu, we say Pikachu. That letter A in Pikachu is representing a schwa vowel sound, that weak or neutral vowel sound.
Yeah, that makes sense. Can you say the website again one more time?
If you just search Pokemon, it's that main Pokemon website, and there's a Pokédex tab that you can go to.
Do you just search Pokemon on Google
Yeah,
or?
yeah, just search Pokemon. If you do Pokemon Pokédex, it should be the first one that comes up. It is the official Pokemon website, and
Okay.
they keep the Pokédex updated when new Pokemon are added in the new games too.
Oh, that's so great. Perfect. I imagine there's some people watching right now that know some Pokemon fanatics, my husband being one of them. So, all right, let's talk about reading fluency and what it is, and then we'll get into the activities.
Reading fluency refers to the ability to read accurately at an appropriate rate and with suitable expression. I teach students the word R, A-R-E, as an acronym to remember accuracy, rate, and expression. And I'll often write it down on the side of, say, sentence level or paragraph level text where I really want them to remember. We need all three of those pieces that we're working on. Let's talk about each one a little more. Accuracy requires that individual words are read exactly as the author wrote them. And that's usually what I tell students too. Not that they read it wrong, but kind of using more neutral language, we need to read exactly what this author wrote. Rate or automaticity refers to the speed with which text is read, which should be a conversational speed. We don't want too fast or too slow. Again, our brains are wired for that oral language. So if things are read at a nice oral language rate, it is easier for us to process. And then expression, I feel like, is often the forgotten piece here. Expression or prosody refers to the pitch, tone, volume, emphasis, and rhythm in speech, but also while reading. It also includes the reader's ability to chunk words into meaningful phrases and use punctuation as a cue to pause appropriately at the ends of sentences.
Okay, thanks for sharing that. I want to go back to accuracy. So maybe like in early reading, a caregiver might not read every single page in the book, or they might read, some of the words. Is that okay?
So we're not talking about that kind of reading. That
Okay.
reading is done more to work on the language piece, right?
Okay.
When I'm talking about reading fluency right now, this is how I want the child to read a text that I give them.
Okay.
So like if it's a beginning reader we're talking about, we're looking at that decodable text. If it's a middle school student, we've pulled an article from something that they're interested in. I want it to be like the accuracy of that text.
Okay. And like 100% accuracy, or do you give like some leeway? Like, what are your goals for something like that?
Yeah, I believe there is a number that I'm blanking on, but I think it's like 95% plus accuracy that you're looking for. Then there's a range of, there's a range where it's kind of within an area that they can read it without getting frustrated. And then there's a lower percentage that they shouldn't be under. That's their frustration level. I have a blog about reading fluency on my website, because this was one of the deep dives that I did, and I did further reading on it. So if you want more information on reading fluency and those numbers, they are in the blog on my website, but I'm forgetting them off the top of my head right now.
Okay. Yeah, your website is great. And we're going to share the website at the very end too, if anybody is interested in kind of diving into your blog. Okay, so let's talk about the activities. And again, if you have any great reading fluency activities, please put them in the chat too.
So I'm going to focus on an activity that works on that expression piece. One activity I do is I call it reading with feeling. So during sentence level reading practice, I have a wheel of feelings that I just made on wheelofnames.com for free. And I use feelings like happy, sad, bored, disgusted. We can kind of add feelings based on, as the student can do happy, sad, mad, and express that. We can work on some of those more nuanced feelings. So I have the student spin the wheel and then read the sentence in that feeling. And we talk about whether that feeling makes sense for that sentence, because we've just got our sentence level reading and a wheel, so they're not always going to match. We talk about if it makes sense, and if not, what feeling would make sense for that sentence. And we'll do that for like an entire page of that sentence level reading practice that we're doing. Very similar, I might give them that list of feelings and they pick a feeling to read a sentence in, but they don't tell me. And I have to guess what feeling they're reading that sentence in. My students think it's a fun game, but I can also see if they're portraying that feeling accurately enough for me to guess it correctly.
Can you give an example?
An example of?
Like an example of reading with feeling, like one particular word you would have and how they would read it.
Well, it's sentence level practice. So I use Ascend Smarter Intervention right now, and their workbooks include a sentence level reading page, usually about 10 sentences that include words that have the target phonics skill we're working on. So instead of just reading the sentences, I layer it in with this expression activity. So it can be any sentences that you're working on reading, and you can really work on pairing that with any feelings and discussing if it makes sense for that sentence or not.
So you would give them like happy or sad, and then they would say like convey correct punctuation or convey correct punctuation, like something like that.
Yeah,
okay.
Something like that. Yeah.
Okay. I love that.
And it's a really fun layer to add to it, but it's important because these activities help students learn that our expression conveys the meaning of the text. And if we change our expression, we change the meaning. Just like how you read that same sentence, but you read it with two different feelings. So like it had a different underlying meaning to it. Mm-hmm. And this is also important when it comes to punctuation. So instead of always just having your students practice reading level with sentences that are statements that have a period at the end, I like to make sure that I'm incorporating exclamation marks and question marks, because we have to adjust our tone to convey the correct punctuation when we're reading. That's something we do naturally in our oral language, but in reading, we really need to make sure if that ends in a question mark, that our voice is rising. I can tell that you're reading, asking a question.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. Yeah, especially with text messaging nowadays.
Yes.
Able to convey the meaning.
So Pokemon reading fluency. If we're using Pokemon in activities, I might encourage students to read with expression by creating a list of different feelings that are associated with Pokemon. For example, we might read sentences happy, like Pikachu, angry, like Wartortle, or sad, like Gloom, and just kind of pair the feeling with a Pokemon for some added fun. To work on word level reading fluency, I might use that word list I created of Pokemon with our target phonics patterns for repeated or timed word level reading activities to work on reading accuracy and rate piece. For sentence to paragraph level, I might have them read Pokédex entries, again, right from that Pokemon website. Repeated reading is important for building fluency, and reading about topics that they're interested in, like Pokemon, can be a meaningful way to engage students in repeated reading practice.
Sounds fun. I love that. All right, so let's dive into vocabulary now.
Yes, well, second last component that we'll talk about today. Vocabulary is the understanding of words and their meanings. It encompasses receptive vocabulary, listening and reading, and expressive vocabulary, speaking and writing. In addition to learning word meanings, vocabulary instruction should include explicitly teaching morphology and the meaning of prefixes, suffixes, and roots, as well as grammar and syntax rules, so readers understand how words are combined to form meaningful sentences. One of the many strengths SLPs have when it comes to providing literacy instruction is our knowledge about vocabulary. We work on vocabulary development with individuals of all ages, and that work is supporting an individual's literacy skills, since vocabulary is a crucial component of literacy. We need to be able to understand the words we're reading in order to understand the text or book, and we can only write words that we have in our vocabulary.
Wow, thank you for sharing that. Okay, so you have your activity ideas here as well, and
Yep.
I've got some examples. So let's chat about those.
One of my favorite vocabulary and combined phonics activities is word ladders. So you give a student a starting word and clues for changing it into another word by changing one sound at a time. So we've got a little visual here to help us through. Say you're working on CVC words with a short A, you might give the starting clue something you wear on your head. And the student would say hat and write hat on the bottom rung of the ladder. Then you give another clue like change one sound in hat. So the word is a flying animal that comes out at night. And the student would say bat and write bat on the next rung. You continue the activity until you get to the top of the ladder. It's similar to the word building activity we discussed for phonics, but with an added vocabulary component because the clues that you're giving are related to the meaning of the word, which they then have to be able to like know which word you're describing and how to spell that word and what letter they need to change. Again, this is an activity I do with articulation clients, but I just change the words in my ladder to be whatever the speech sound is that we're working on.
And do you usually use like a visual, or is it something you just orally do?
Oh, it's a visual. I have word ladder templates that I use, and on my store, I have word ladders for all the different phonics patterns that I use with my students. So I've got that visual, and then they write the words on the ladder.
Well, that's great. I notice you're not really mentioning like prefixes and suffixes. Do people like still teach those and address those? Or do you really want to like not treat it as like a unit? You want to teach those as individual like sounds?
Oh, you want to teach them as a unit because they carry meaning. So there's a lot to talk about, so I tried to narrow down my talk, but English is a morpho-phonemic language, so it does depend on the morphology piece and the phonics. Typically, I use syllable types to work on those base words, but then the prefixes and suffixes, those affixes that we add to words, you want to teach that like pre together as a unit because pre is a meaningful unit. It means before. When we add that to the base word, it's going to change that meaning.
Okay. And then, so is this considered like suffixes or no? That would be like the ed, ing.
Ed, ing, full, those would be examples of suffixes.
Okay. So these are just like CVC words. Like
Yep.
they're sounding out those individual sounds when they're reading this.
Yeah, I find for word ladders, now I guess I could make word ladders that have more of a morphology component, but the word ladders that I do when you're just changing one sound at a time is typically base words that you're working on.
Okay. Okay. Thank you for explaining that.
Of course. Now, when you have those longer words and you're trying to break down, okay, the base word and how does adding a suffix or prefix change the meaning, this next idea here, a Frayer or four-square model, might come in handy. So when you're teaching new vocabulary words that you come across in texts or other activities, it's important to take the time to explicitly teach that new word and provide students with opportunity to build connections. So one way to do this is through concept mapping. For example, this Frayer or four-square model. And it includes writing the word in the middle, generating a student-friendly definition in one corner, listing characteristics of the word, examples or synonyms, and then non-examples or antonyms. So this might be a nice activity to do with like accidentally. So your base word is accident, and then you've got like ali, you've got some of those suffixes added, and you could talk about those different pieces as well.
Okay. Now, I spoke with another SLP a while back on the podcast, and one of the things that she talked about, she also had an interest in literacy, but she was saying the curriculum moves so fast nowadays that it's so difficult to teach the vocabulary within the curriculum because by the time you've taught it, they are like 5 steps ahead. So is this where like teaching more like executive functioning comes in to like having the child be able to like sound out the word in reading and increase their reading fluency, but also having like those executive functioning skills to like maybe do the research on their own, like while they're
Yeah.
reading, do the highlighting. There's so much technology nowadays where you can like look at the definition of a word. What are your recommendations for that?
Working on executive functioning skills is great. Working on those kind of the word awareness, like what's the base word? What are the prefixes and suffixes? How does that change the meaning of the word? Kind of being like word detectives and having that knowledge of, I don't know this word, I've got to figure it out what it means. What are my strategies for figuring it out? So working on some more of that strategy component with students that they can go and apply to new words that they encounter.
The strategy component. Okay, makes sense.
Let's briefly talk about some Pokemon vocabulary. So one thing I like to do is have students read Pokédex entries to build vocabulary knowledge. If you've never read Pokédex entries, you should go check them out on the Pokemon website. They are very short, just a couple sentences, but they're filled with high-level vocabulary. And you can have students read the entry for a Pokemon, maybe a Pokemon whose name you were practicing for that phonics component. And then while they're reading the Pokédex entry, highlight any new or key vocabulary words in the entries, and then support them to define these words, possibly using that four-square model. Pokemon names are also great for working on etymology, word origin, and morphology, determining those word parts and their meanings. So Pokemon names don't have prefixes and suffixes, but the names often give us information about the Pokemon itself. For example, Bulbasaur. Bulb means the resting state of a plant, and then saur is, well, that one is a suffix. It's the Greek suffix meaning lizard. So then we can use those word pieces to say that, oh, well, Bulbasaur is a plant lizard. Or similarly, Voltorb. Volt is a unit of electricity, and orb is a sphere. So electric sphere, which is spot on for that Pokemon. So if you're interested in doing more activities like this with students, there's a great website, Pokemon Name Origins Etymology, that gives you all this information for the different Pokemon names.
Oh, that's great. I imagine you could do that with like other topics as well. There's so much online nowadays.
Totally. That's often how we create new words, is by using these meaningful chunks from other words, other languages.
Yeah, no, that's true. All right, so it's our last and final component of the presentation. Let's talk about reading comprehension.
So comprehension is the understanding and interpretation of what is read, the overall goal of reading.
Mhm.
It's the result of the integration of all the components we've discussed today. One helpful resource for reading comprehension instruction and activities is the Reading Comprehension Blueprint by Nancy Lewis Hennessy. This book outlines the importance of distinguishing between the processes and products of reading comprehension. The processes are the cognitive activities that help a reader get to the product. For example, we have to activate background knowledge, make predictions and inferences, monitor our understanding of words, and so on. This is where a lot of that executive function we were talking about fits in. The products are what the reader understands and knows after reading. So we might demonstrate our understanding through a story retell or answering comprehension questions.
Okay.
The instructional components of supporting reading comprehension include working on vocabulary, sentence comprehension, text structures like narrative, informational, and opinion, and background knowledge and levels of understanding and inference.
Awesome. Okay, let's go into the activities.
I find that levels of understanding and inference is an area where many of my students struggle.
Mm.
In order to make meaning from text, readers need to understand both explicitly and implicitly stated information and ideas. Global coherence inferences are necessary for deep comprehension and depend on the reader's access to their related background knowledge. So instruction should include teaching students how to integrate background knowledge and using graphic organizers designed to prompt connections between the text and their knowledge. So for example, a inference organizer might include a section for the question, what does it say? We're going to, so the question that you're answering about the text, like, how does this person feel? For example, that's something we usually have to use some inferencing skills for. So that might be our general question in this example. How do they feel? Then we might have a section, the organizer, what does it say? So we're going to pull relevant information from the text. What does the text say? And then a section for what do I know? Where you're going to make connections based on what you know from background knowledge or other text connections, other texts you've read, other movies or shows. Sometimes students have a hard time making a connection that's personal, but there's other types of connections we can make that's still part of our background knowledge. And then the last section would be, so I know. And then that they would use the information from the text, from their background knowledge to make an educated guess to answer that initial prediction or inferencing question. And this approach is especially helpful for students who have the necessary background knowledge, but they don't surface it or like apply it independently while they're reading. One thing to keep in mind with graphic organizers is you will want to fade them over time. You don't want the student to get dependent on always using it, but it can be a good way to explicitly teach the strategy that you want them to use.
Can you give the name of the graphic organizer you were just explaining again?
So that is outlined in the reading comprehension blueprint.
Oh, okay. It's not something that's like available online in different formats. It's copyrighted by this person?
I'm not sure. That's a good question. It's an easy enough one to make by yourself. We're
Yeah.
going to do what does it say from the text? What do I know? That's your background knowledge. And then so I think.
Okay.
So how do we pull those two pieces together?
Okay. Thank you.
Last, we'll talk about reading comprehension with Pokemon. So Pokemon entries, those Pokédex entries, are short texts. So they're great for working on sentence comprehension, vocabulary, and even inferences. For example, a Pokédex entry for one of my favorite Pokemon, Venusaur, says, while it basks in the sun, it can convert the light into energy. As a result, it is more powerful in the summertime. Seems simple, but there's a lot to unpack here to really understand this entry. The student needs to understand the words basks, convert, and energy. We also have the word it being used, and that's a cohesive tie or pronoun referent that refers to Venusaur. So every time it says it is replacing the word Venusaur. It's referring to Venusaur. We could also make some inferences about what environments Venusaur might live in, likely places that are sunny and warm because it converts sunlight into energy. And what might happen if Venusaur was stuck somewhere cloudy and rainy? Likely it would be less powerful because it wouldn't have access to sunlight.
Awesome. I think that was a great example. And yeah, I could see how complex just a sentence like that would be if someone is, on the newer side of reading, like three really difficult words in there. It makes it hard to discern, like, okay, what's the sentence actually saying?
A lot of times I think as adults, we think something seems simple,
Yeah.
but there's really so much that goes into reading and achieving that thorough understanding of what is read.
Well, and I think too, just like based on my experience when I was, learning to read, that you can get hung up even on one word and then it kind of messes with like the rest of either the passage or the sentence. So the new technology where you're able to look at the definition of the word like on the spot is super helpful because it keeps like the momentum going, I think.
Mhm.
And I know there's so many other components to it, but These are all of your references and resources. Did you want to expand on any of these before we wrap up today?
I think, well, those references are some of those foundational resources that I use for building this presentation. So definitely check those out if you're more interested. And then resources, some of the activities that I mentioned, I have resources for in my store. And then there's the Pokédex and the Pokemon names, origins, etymology, if you're interested in using more Pokemon in your activities.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And where can everybody find and connect with you?
So you can find me on Instagram at slp.literacy.corner. You can email me, Brianna at slpliteracycorner.com. And then that's my website there as well, slpliteracycorner.ca or .com. It'll route you to the same website. And then the blog is there that goes into a lot more information about some of these topics. I also do a summary of all the professional development literacy books that I read. So if you are interested in learning more, that might be a good place too.
Awesome. And that's all of our handles and website as well. Thank you so much, Brianna. This has been incredible. It was a great deep dive and a refresh of these like literacy concepts and the evidence behind all of it.
Thanks for having me. I hope that you're walking away with a lot of different literacy activities to incorporate into your sessions.
Definitely.